This program is going to be principally focused on the three very important series of meetings which have taken place over the last 24 hours. The first is President Zelensky of Ukraine's visit to the United States. He's meeting with President Biden. He's addressed to Congress and the results of that meeting. The second is the meeting of the Collegium of the Russian Ministry of Defense. I understand that Collegium is in fact the correct word rather than board. Board is a translation that the Russians have been using, but Collegium is a much more accurate description of what happened. Anyway, the meeting of the Collegium of the Russian Ministry of Defense, which also took place yesterday and which heard comments from the Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. And the last is the important meeting that took place between Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, and the Chinese President Xi Jinping. So that's going to be the focus of my meeting, but I will begin first, as I traditionally do, with just a few words about the situation on the battlefields. And here we have a significant amount of news, though it is more news about very heavy losses suffered by Ukraine, about the Ukrainians trying to send more reinforcements to hold the line in Donbass, in Bakhmut, in the areas around Donetsk city, near Marinka, for example, and also in Kharkiv region, where the Russians are pressing forward their advantage in their advance towards Kupiansk. And it's more, as I said, information about Ukrainian attempts to try and reinforce these positions and continued Russian advances in all of these areas, rather than talk yet of any significant breakthrough. The reason for this is that even as the Russians advance incrementally, and I've read sometimes that it can be 100 meters at a time, but that just gives you some idea. It's not kilometers or tens of kilometers. It's not huge advances, 300 kilometers over a course of a single day, which apparently happened when the Russian military first entered Ukraine at the start of this year, in February of this year. Well, it's not sweeping advances like that. It is very, very heavy fighting, incremental advances by the Russians, fighting intense resistance by the Ukrainians, with the Ukrainians definitely suffering extremely heavy losses. Heavier losses, much heavier losses, indisputably, than those which the Russians are. And for the record, I've now seen some actually very convincing reports about the Russian artillery shelling in Bakhmut. And it seems that most of the shelling that's now taking place in and around Bakhmut is not from the big, heavy, long-range guns like the Malka. In earlier videos, I referred to it as the Matka, but in fact it is the Malka, the 203 millimeter, very powerful long-range gun that the Russians have. It's not big guns like that, or Russian 152 millimeter guns, which the Russian military has in abundance. Most of the shelling that's now going on in Bakhmut, and which is extremely intense from the Russian side, is of mortars and shorter range guns. Some of these mortars, by the way, are very powerful. There's even one mortar, the Tulpan, which has a caliber of 240 millimeters, which makes it, as a Russian commentator pointed out to me in a private email, makes the Tulpan the artillery piece with the biggest caliber in the Russian military. I refer to the Malka as having the biggest caliber. It is in fact the Tulpan. I don't know to what extent the Tulpan is being deployed in Bakhmut, but regardless of that, the that could be used there. There's the TOS-1 flamethrower vehicles, multiple launch rocket systems which fire thermobaric missiles with rockets with thermobaric warheads. That apparently is also deployed in that area. And of course there's lots of other guns, including mortars and shorter range guns, like the 120 millimeter mortars that are the standard mortars today of the Russian army. And the fact that we're talking mainly about mortars and rockets and that kind of artillery tells us how close the battle lines are and how intense the fighting is. Now, there's some reports which speak about growing opposition from Ukrainian troops when they're ordered to launch advances into Bakhmut, that they're apparently reluctant to do it, that sometimes they outright refuse orders. The Ukrainian military apparently have had to take fierce action to try to sometimes force Ukrainian troops to attack or engage in counterattacks against sometimes the wishes of these troops, that kind of story. Up to fairly recently, I've tended to ignore these kind of reports. Most of these reports come from the Russian side, and you do get occasional reports from the Ukrainian side that also speak of the reluctance of Ukrainian soldiers to be thrown into what is now in effect the meat grinder, and it'd be very understandable if that reluctance existed, given all the information we're getting about the situation in Bakhmut. But anyway, I've tended to avoid mentioning this topic because, of course, both sides have made claims about the collapsing morale of the other, the Ukrainians, and by the way, the British Ministry of Defence very often, and the various American government agencies, the Pentagon, the State Department, all of those, the intelligence community there have also at times spoken of low morale amongst Russian troops. Anyway, I've tended to ignore that because a lot of this seems to me to be uncorroborated propaganda. But actually, thinking about it, we've had some revelations now from the Ukrainian side which seem to point to the fact that the Ukrainian military is indeed suffering from morale problems, and the Russian military is not, or at least not to the extent that has been reported. If we talk about the situation of the Russian military, there was the admission from General Zelensky, the Ukrainian commander-in-chief, in the interview he gave to The Economist, that Russia's mobilization has worked, that Russian troops are prepared to fight, that the Russians don't seem to have significant morale problems. There's an important admission which flatly contradicts all the claims about collapsing morale on the Russian side and a botched mobilization that we've been reading in the Western media and hearing from various Western and Ukrainian government officials. And then there's something else that General Zelensky has done, which does point to problems on the Ukrainian side with morale, which is that he's apparently asking for tougher penalties for Ukrainian soldiers who desert. Now, that strongly suggests that there are some Ukrainian soldiers, it's impossible, of course, to quantify their number, who are deserting, that the Ukrainian military does have a problem of desertions. Otherwise, why make a request of this kind? So it does seem that the Ukrainian military is suffering from some morale problems, whereas the Ukrainians themselves, or at least General Zelensky, have now cast doubt on the multiple claims you repeatedly read and hear that the Russians are suffering from morale problems. So I just wanted to say that because I think it is important. But as I said, tense fighting going on in Bakhmut, lots of reports of very heavy Ukrainian losses, and now it seems reluctance on the part of some Ukrainian soldiers to engage in the fighting. This is what the Russians say, could be true, and evidence from the Ukrainian side that they are indeed suffering from desertion problems, which does point to low or reduced morale, obliging the Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief, General Zelensky, to make a request for tougher penalties, much tougher penalties for desertion to be imposed on Ukrainian soldiers who do desert. So it seems to me that the meat grinder that we've been hearing so much about in Bakhmut remains in full operation. The Russians do appear to be making incremental progress in the city itself. There's still some access points from which the Ukrainians can continue to send men and supplies into Bakhmut, into the center of Bakhmut, though these are becoming increasingly dangerous to use since they are covered by Russian artillery. The Ukrainians continue to build trenches. They still seem to be intent on fortifying Bakhmut. And of course, Zelensky himself, according to the Ukrainians, went to Bakhmut. As I said, there's actually now increasing skepticism on the Russian side whether he did actually go to Bakhmut, but I'm not going to discuss this. I'm going to just take it as read that he did go to Bakhmut if more information comes to light. Anyway, I will report it, but for the moment I'm going to go with the official Ukrainian view on this. Anyway, Zelensky went to Bakhmut, stayed in the western suburbs away from, as I said, the main fighting, didn't go to the center of Bakhmut, didn't say very much that he was there. His visit did not receive a great deal of coverage in the Ukrainian or indeed even the international media, but as we will see, it did provide him with a brief talking point when he addressed Congress, which is exactly what I said the purpose of his visit or presumed visit to the outskirts of Bakhmut was all about. And it was the other thing that Zelensky intended was to make sure that there was no retreat from Bakhmut, at least not whilst he was traveling to Washington. So anyway, that's my summary of the situation on the battlefields. I would just add that there was one event which takes me back to Putin's comments to the officials of Russia's internal security agencies about the complicated situation they will face in the 4 regions of Ukraine, formerly Ukraine, which Russia has now, if you prefer, whether you prefer to say annexed or united with, I leave that to you. A Russian official, Dmitry Rogozin, who has been quite an important figure in the Russian political universe for quite a long time and who's held very senior posts in the Russian government. He was for a while deputy prime minister in charge of military procurement. He's also been head of Roscosmos, the Russian space agency. He's not actually got a role of anything like that importance for the moment, but he is still a well-known political figure in Russia and somebody who is very much, I should say, on the right-wing nationalist spectrum of Russian politics. Anyway, he visited Donetsk city and he arranged to have a meal at a restaurant in Donetsk city, and whilst he was sitting down at the table, the Ukrainians launched an artillery strike on this particular restaurant, and 2 people apparently killed, Rogozin himself was wounded, as several others were. Rogozin himself is not apparently in any danger of losing his life. But of course, the fact that the Ukrainians did carry out this artillery strike shows that they were intending to kill him and that they knew he was there. Now, for them to have known that he was there again shows a breach in security. It means that somehow or other the Ukrainians got information about Rogozin's whereabouts. And I said in a video a few days ago that the Russians have carried out a major dragnet rounding up Ukrainian spies and informers in Donetsk and Lugansk, but clearly the Ukrainian networks have not been completely cleaned out. There are still some people in the Donetsk Republic, in Donetsk city, who are able to keep Ukraine informed of the movement of important Russian officials or former officials like Rogozin. Now, let me reiterate one more time that when Putin addressed the people in the internal security agencies and spoke about the complicated situation that they faced in the four regions, he was talking not about the military situation, but about this problem of the presence of these Ukrainian networks in these four regions. I say that because I continue to read article after article appearing in the Western media, which takes Putin's words out of context, borrows its language from the, frankly, inadequate translation of his words provided by Reuters, and gives the impression that Putin somehow admitted that the entire military situation that the Russians were facing in the conflict was difficult. Putin did not say that. He was speaking to internal security officials about the complexity or difficulty of the challenge they would face in resolving the internal security issues that exist in Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. That was all that his words were about. And nobody should try to expand the meaning of his words beyond the meaning they actually have. Anyway, I'm not going to waste more time on that. It's just that if you still see, as you probably will, articles in various places in the media, in the West and elsewhere, even around the global south, this has been reported because of the international reach that Reuters have. If you read that Putin was talking about a difficult situation for the Russians in their totality in this conflict zone, well, that is a misreading of his words. Now, let's now turn to the various meetings, which are, as I said, the main focus of this program today. First of all, Zelensky's visit to Washington. He met with Biden in the White House. They had a joint press conference. He visited Congress, where he made a very predictable speech indeed. He specifically referred to Ukraine's fight and its determination to go on fighting. And he referred, of course, to the fight in Bakhmut as an example of the heroic resistance that the Ukrainians are putting up in their conflict against the people he referred to as the occupiers, in other words, the Russians. And of course that explains the purpose of his visit to Bakhmut. He did not want a collapse in Bakhmut at this time. He wanted to make absolutely sure that Bakhmut held, because of course it is, for the moment, his main talking point that the Ukrainians are fighting to the bitter end for every inch of their homeland, of their country, against the invading Russians, and that they're fighting to the death, and they're fighting in places like Bakhmut. He didn't want, over the course of this visit, to have that whole situation, that whole narrative pulled from under his feet. And in the case of Zelensky, it's important to say that maintaining narratives is a very much, at least in his own perception, very much his main, if you like, role in this conflict. He is not, in my opinion, particularly interested in economic matters. He's never shown any real interest in economic policy. He doesn't take the direct role in meeting with economic officials to anything like the extent that Putin does, for example. There's some debate about his role in military decision-making. My impression is that when he does engage in military decision-making, which is probably quite often, it is again always with the presentational optics, if you like, in mind. And that's very much his style, and we saw that again over the course of his visit to Washington. So what came out of this visit of Zelensky's to Washington? A whirlwind trip. He meets Biden, he goes to Congress, he delivers a speech which, in my opinion, said very little that was new or original or different from things that we've heard many times. I'm not going to analyze it any further. There was always, unsurprisingly, the applause and all that, which again is entirely unsurprising as well. But what did he actually achieve when he was there? Now that brings us back to this question of why he went there at all. And I'm going to say straightforwardly that the reason he went there is the one I am sure that I gave the other day, which is that the administration told him to come because they want to get this omnibus budget bill through Congress by Friday. We've got only a very short time window to get it done. The new Congress comes into session on the 3rd of January. There's a Republican majority in the House, and that might start to make difficulties for the president and for his administration, especially with more and more Republicans now coming out and becoming increasingly concerned about the amount of funding that is being provided to Ukraine. I've even seen, by the way, some tweets from what you might call populist Republicans criticizing the establishment Republican leadership in the Senate, people like Mitch McConnell. They're pointing out that there seems to be hundreds of billions of dollars available to send to Ukraine, but there was never apparently $5 billion to enable Donald Trump to build and complete his border wall. So you can see the kind of narrative that is starting to take hold amongst Republicans, and with the Republicans now in the majority in the House of Representatives, and it becoming increasingly clear that the populist wing of the Republican Party has gained strength both in the House and also amongst Republicans in the Senate. 10 Republican senators voted against Mitch McConnell's re-election as Republican leader in the Senate. That was reported as a comfortable victory for McConnell, but in fact, it shows that there is now, for the first time, a significant amount of opposition to him amongst Republicans in the Senate. With all of that, with all of this opposition starting to grow, it is unsurprising that the administration is pulling out all the stops to try and get this bill, this omnibus budget bill, passed with its allocation of support to Ukraine, and with the Republican leadership in the Senate fully on board with this plan against what is likely to be gathering opposition. And note that the $44 billion that's been allocated for support to Ukraine in this bill is supposed to carry through for the whole of 2023. Now, Zelensky, of course, came with a slightly different agenda. In fact, a considerably difficult agenda. First of all, he wants much more money. $44 billion is less than the $100+ billion which Ukraine has already received. And of course, he wanted much more advanced weapons. He wanted, again, ATACMS long-range missiles. He wanted many more tanks, many more infantry fighting vehicles, all sorts of things, in air defense systems. There are times when it strikes me that Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials are frankly oblivious to the limits upon which the United States operates. They seem to assume that the United States can just crank out unlimited supplies of weapons, and that's very much the kind of rhetoric they have. And they come along to the United States and address Western officials, and they talk in that way. And that is what Zelensky did. But he got nothing. And I think this is an important point to make. He actually got, I think, much less than he expected. The government, the administration, has now unveiled another $2 billion aid package to Ukraine. Now, that sounds like a lot, but the greater part of that money is made up by the cost of the supply of one system, which is, of course, the Patriot missile system, about which we have been hearing so much. Biden himself was clear that ATACMS missiles and these other types of weapon systems that Zelensky wants, he's not going to get. And in fact, if you go through the rest of the arms package, which I'm not going to do, Brian Beletic at the New Atlas does it far better than I do, and you should go to his channel and you will find his analysis of all of these arms packages there. The rest of it, frankly, is more of the same. The only item of significance is this Patriot system. Now, there's been a great deal written about and said about the Patriot system, and I'm just going to add a few things to things that I've said previously. But there's been a good discussion of the Patriot missile delivery by Scott Ritter and Garland Nixon on their channel, and also, of course, by Brian Beletic in a video that he did a short time ago. Now, Brian Beletic made the point that this single battery that is being supplied to Ukraine, there are limits to the amount of, that there are operational constraints on the use of the Patriot missile because of the general shortages, of the great shortage of Patriot missiles, and of the difference in increasing production of Patriot missiles. Quite simply, there aren't enough of these things to go around, and this is part of the overall problem the United States and the Western powers are facing in keeping up with Ukraine's voracious, insatiable demands for weapon systems, for ammunition. The Ukrainians, as I said, seem to think that there is no limit to what the US can supply, when in fact there are more and more limits, and they're becoming extremely difficult. Now, very amazingly, on the 20th of December, an article appeared in, of all places, The Guardian, by Jack Watling, who is a senior luminary of Britain's Royal United Services Institute, who completely corroborated the very points that Brian Beletic has been making about the general shortage of Patriot missiles, and indeed the general problems with supplying weapons to Ukraine. And I'm going to read some extracts from this article in The Guardian because I thought it was very interesting. And this is what this article says. These are extracts. Some fear that giving certain military support to Ukraine risks wider escalation, but this was not the basis for US reluctance to send Patriot systems. The United States has significantly fewer of them than its own operational analysis suggests are necessary to defend its forces in the Indo-Pacific. Moreover, there is continuing demand for missiles from existing users from Sweden to Saudi Arabia. The latter expends a significant number of missiles each month in defense of its critical national infrastructure. Missile manufacturing levels, meanwhile, are low. And then there's a great deal about how there's a section then that follows which discusses how the hollowing out of NATO's defence industries has left the alliance in poor shape to sustain high-intensity operations. In the case of systems such as Patriot, the challenge is greater because it takes much longer to manufacture precision weapons such as air defence missiles than it does to make unguided artillery rounds. Quite an interesting revelation. And then we go on to read, Russia's invasion of Ukraine should prompt the regeneration of NATO's industrial base, but this will take time. In the interval before increased supply is available, and we're talking about years, not months, and it might never happen, and with current pressure on demand, there is a risk that providing key systems to Ukraine, the West does so at the expense of its deterrence posture towards China over its threats to Taiwan's independence. Note that Jack Watlin talks about Taiwan's independence, something which, of course, the United States and NATO pretend they don't recognize. But I'm not going to go there in this video. And then he goes on to say this, facing such competing pressures, the US and other Ukrainian partners have had to balance carefully the support they provide Ukraine between those systems its military can be trained to operate, and it's now conceded, Scott Ritter and Garland Nixon had a good discussion about this, that it will take roughly 5 months for Ukraine to be ready to operate the system. Between those systems, its military can be trained to operate, that which NATO's defence industry can sustain, and the donor's own security needs. Now, I'm going to just highlight here the words which NATO's defence industry can sustain, because when we come to the discussion about the meeting of the Collegium of the Ministry of Defence in Moscow, we're going to see the challenge that the West might be facing very soon in terms of military production. But anyway, repeat again that there is a balance between those systems Ukraine's military can be trained to operate, that which NATO's defense industry can sustain, and the donor's own security needs. And then there is a very interesting phrase. While Patriot offers a good option for defeating cruise and ballistic missiles, I'm going to mention in a moment that there's some doubts about that. It is important that local air defense officers understand that they cannot expend an endless supply of these munitions and that they prioritize them accordingly. Patriot is certainly capable of downing Iranian-made Shahed 136s. These are the Uranium-2 drones that we've been hearing so much about. But if it is used in this role, Kiev will run out of missiles fast. This has already happened with GMLRS, That's the HIMARS missiles, the long-range rocket provided to Ukraine. Although its forces were initially capable to use, I'm going to say HIMARS missiles, against high priority targets, it has increasingly been employed more widely, contributing to operational success in the liberation of Kherson, but significantly exceeding the rate of consumption of these missiles, supportable by Ukraine's partners. And the article then finishes by saying that Ukraine needs to be supplied with, the weapons it needs to defend itself, but this will require some innovative thinking and investment by Ukraine's partners. It is also vital for global stability that the provision of these stocks is matched by an ability to industrially replenish NATO stocks and to convince China that production can be sustained in the event of a larger conflict. Now, again, that's not going to happen for many years. And if we're talking about the US competing with China in production matters, well, you can forget it right away. But anyway, that's how the article ends. So, we see the problem of push-pull. There are the hardliners in Washington, the neocons, entrenched in the National Security Council, the State Department, to some extent the intelligence community. And against them are arrayed the Pentagon and the other people who have to think about the broader range of security challenges that the United States faces. And the hardliners support Zelensky and Zelensky in demanding that the United States provide everything that Ukraine is asking for. We've had that extraordinary op-ed by Boris Johnson in the Wall Street Journal saying Ukraine should be given every conceivable weapon that it wants. Forget about escalation from the Russians. The key thing is to get Ukraine to win and win conclusively, and therefore they should be given everything they want. And then you have the other people, the realists, the people in the Pentagon, who have to worry about potential threats in all sorts of places, problems with Iran, problems with China. Who knows what other problems may arise in the Middle East, in Africa, wherever. And they say, we can't just go on giving Ukraine everything it wants. There has to be a limit, because unless we impose those limits, we are going to run into very serious problems in terms of what we can do, our own power projection capabilities, our ability to take on the Russians in all sorts of places. And coming back to the topic of the Patriot missile system, and a most interesting email from somebody who is authoritatively well informed about the Patriot system and who is somebody who has an expertise in this area, which I certainly don't have. But this person, I'm not going to discuss again who it is, it's a private email. This person explained one of its problems and one of the reasons, by the way, for its very high cost, which is that as the United States has a tendency to do, it tried to integrate into a single missile lots of different objectives. It tried to make the Patriot missile, and apparently there is only one missile. I mean, there are various upgrades, but at any one particular time, a Patriot missile battery only has one missile. They tried to give that missile multiple roles. It can be used, it supposedly can be used against cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, aircraft, drones, all those sort of things. And that is asking a single missile to do too many things. It makes it an overcomplicated, over-expensive system, and its problem is that though it can do all of those things, it cannot do them optimally because it is designed for too many roles. By contrast, the Russians with the S-300 and S-400 went in a completely different direction. They designed systems based not around one single missile tasked to carry out multiple different roles, but around a system that uses many different missiles, some long range, some short range, some bigger, some smaller, each of which is prioritized to be used against one type of particular threat. Drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, rockets, aircraft. And this has proved apparently a much more workable and effective system, and why countries like Turkey, India and others, when they look at the capabilities of the Russian systems and compare them with the American, they tend to prefer the Russian, because the Russian system actually works better. You optimize a particular missile for one particular target instead of trying to use one missile to cover all of those targets. Anyway, I thought it was an interesting discussion. I should say that there is one other missile system of perhaps comparable sophistication to the Patriot, which is the Astra system produced by France. And interestingly enough, that uses two missiles for two different roles. So it's a bit more like the Russian system, though not to the same extent. But the problem with Astra is apparently there aren't many launchers. There's only about 10 batteries of Astra systems, or maybe 15 altogether. There simply aren't enough of these systems basically to hand them out to Ukraine in a way that would make any conceivable difference. So I just mentioned that because it was an interesting email, and of course if people want to argue with that point, they're very welcome to. But Scott Ritter and Garland Nixon, there was a good discussion about the problems of using the Patriot missile and how it's actually not a particularly effective missile for the kind of roles that Ukraine has, that its range is not particularly great, and that there are severe limits to how it can be used. Anyway, that's enough of that. The point is that Zelensky was brought to Washington. He came there. Perhaps he did his job to some extent. He was able to help the administration get its omnibus bill through Congress before it rises on Friday. But he certainly didn't get the weapons that he wanted. And this article in The Guardian and the far more detailed and objective analyses of this kind of problem provided by Brian Beletic explains why. Now, at the same time as Zelensky is in Washington, we have had the board meeting, or the collegium meeting, of the Ministry of Defense in Moscow. And this has been a huge meeting, brought together, as I said, 15,000 people in total. And there are pictures of serried ranks of people in military uniforms listening to reports from Shoigu and Putin. And there's a fairly lengthy transcript of Shoigu's and Putin's words on the Kremlin website. They haven't yet completed the English translation, so I'm going to use a machine translation in places, but I don't think it's in any way particularly defective. And I'm going to discuss a little bit about what is coming, because of course it points directly to the problems that the West is going to experience in trying to keep Ukraine equipped. Now, first of all, Shoigu talked about the political background. I'm going to focus initially on Shoigu's words. He says things like this. After the revelations of Mrs. Merkel, Poroshenko, and other politicians about the true goals of the Minsk agreement, it became obvious to everyone that it was not Russia that was the source of the conflict in the Ukraine. The reason was the Western-funded coup d'etat in Kiev in 2014, which brought anti-Russian forces to power and divided the fraternal peoples. This provoked an armed confrontation in Donbass. Now, we're going to hear more and more about this. We're going to learn huge amounts from the Russians. They're going to talk endlessly about Poroshenko's and Merkel's admission. People in the West don't want to hear this, but from the Russian point of view, Merkel's interviews was a gift. It shows that they were right all along and that there was no possibility of the Russians achieving a peaceful resolution of the crisis in Ukraine, because neither Ukraine nor the Western powers, not even the Germans, supposedly, I've expressed my views about this, wanted to achieve it. But anyway, we now have a long article, a long sort of rather series of speeches about the kind of things that the Russians are going to do. And Putin, first of all, talked about a huge increase next year in Russian arms production. And not just, and that comes on top of what was already apparently a very big increase in Russian arms production this year. He spoke about one particular sector of the arms industry, he didn't say which one, where production has increased by 106%. Not quite sure what that refers to, but we don't have the full details. But anyway, the fact is apparently there's been a big increase in arms production this year. Well, there's going to be big investments, and Russian arms production is going to increase even further. But the other thing that is very interesting, and now I'm going back to what Shoigu says, is that the Russians are now planning a very considerable increase in the size of their armed forces. And here I'm going to say a little bit about the kind of developments that the Russians are looking at before I go into the details of what Shoigu said. Briefly, it's very interesting to me that the major focus was on the ground forces. Now, up to now, in the various funding packages that we've seen provided to the military over the last 10, 15, 20 years, the major priority has been Russia's strategic nuclear forces. That priority remains. That's been made very clear, both by Putin and Shoigu in these reports. Putin said that this was the guarantee, the strategic nuclear forces were the guarantee of Russia's sovereignty and independence. So there's not going to be any slackening of support for that. But funding has gone heavily to the Air Force, and it's produced results with the considerable increase in Russian military aircraft production and the ongoing introduction of Russia's fifth generation fighter jet, the Sukhoi 57. But there's also been heavy investment in the Navy. And I noticed that there's much less talk about the Navy in this series of speeches by Shoigu and Putin. And I'm going to say what I think here. I think that Russian leaders, not for the first time in Russia's history, have found that whilst the Navy for Russia is important, the Russian ground forces are essential. Now, the Russian ground forces have probably been, this is my guess, the lowest priority until fairly recently in defense allocations. That is now changing. The Russian ground forces, the army, are now becoming a much higher priority, and we're going to see a major expansion. And this is what Shoigu had to say. When recruiting the armed forces, gradually we're going to increase the age of conscription of citizens, which is currently 18 to 21 years, and raise the limit, 18 to 27 years, and change it to 21 to 30 years. To ensure the possibility at the request of citizens to enter military service under contract from the first day of joining service. So people are going to be offered the option either of a year as conscripts or a longer period, but paid much higher pay as contract soldiers. And he goes on to say that the Moscow and Leningrad military districts, which existed in the Soviet era, are going to be revived. He then says that there will be 3 entirely new motorized rifle divisions created, partly to defend Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. There's also going to be an army corps in Karelia. This is to counter the fact that Sweden and Finland are going to be joining NATO. He then says that there will be 7 motorized rifle brigades which are going to be converted into full motorized rifle divisions. So they're going to be increased in size, and that means that the much touted military reform that took place under the former defense minister Serdyukov between 2008 and 2012, which looked to transfer the Russian military from a division or to a brigade type structure, well, that's been now completely reversed. Russia is going back fully to the division format. There will now be aviation brigades of 80 to 100 combat helicopters attached to Russian tank forces. There'll be 3 directorates of aviation divisions, 8 bomber aviation regiments, 1 fighter regiment, and 6 army aviation brigades. Now, from what I can tell, these are going to be Air Force units allocated to supporting the ground forces. There's also going to be they're also going to form 5 artillery divisions, as well as high-capacity artillery brigades. Now, the Soviet structure was that the artillery divisions, tended to use 150mm caliber guns and howitzers, and the artillery brigades used heavier guns and howitzers like the 203 Malka and the 240mm mortar, the Tulpan. Well, there's going to be more of that. And then he talks about the coastal troops of the Navy on the basis of the existing Marine brigades. They're going to be converted into divisions. There's going to be an increase in the Russian naval infantry forces. They're going to be converted from brigades into divisions. They're going to be expanded in size. And in addition, 2 entirely new assault paratroop divisions are going to be created, bringing the number of paratroop divisions up to 6, which is only 1 short of the 7 airborne divisions that the Soviet army used to field. So a very substantial increase of the airborne forces as well. Then he talks extensively, Shoigu talks extensively about reorganization of the mobilization system, and he also speaks about the necessity to maintain the importance of the strategic forces. So that was an interesting report from Shoigu. Makes it very clear that the commitment to the war is unchanging, that the fight will continue right through to its conclusion. The war will continue to its conclusion, however long it takes. The resources are being provided, but beyond that, there's going to be an increase in the Russian army from 1 million to 1.5 million men. The number of contract troops is also going to be increased. There is a major Russian build-up, ground forces build-up now underway. And all of this to counter NATO forces at a time when therefore by their own logistical and inventory problems and industrial problems are being highlighted, and at a time when the West is facing an even bigger challenge from China. In many videos which I made before the start of the war, I talked about how the United States and NATO are facing a commitments crisis, that the United States cannot be strong everywhere all the time, that it's got to try and find some kind of compromise with its adversaries, China and Russia, because the way things are going, it's going to find itself outgunned and outspent and outnumbered in every conceivable theatre, because its forces are becoming overstretched. Well, one consequence of the Ukraine war is that commitments crisis is now becoming much worse, and we see that with the speech from Shoigu. And then, of course, we had a follow-up speech, and this, I got the impression that it was largely extemporized from Putin. He made two speeches, one in which he introduced Shoigu, spoke about the much greater increase in military production, but then he talked about the challenges that Russia faces and why they've had to engage in this major build-up. And he said, as I have said more than once and even wrote in my articles, our strategic opponents, note that he now calls them opponents. He used to call the Western states partners, but now they are clearly opponents, have the goal of disintegrating and weakening and dismembering our country. And they've had that goal over the centuries, and there is nothing new. They think we are too big and that our country poses a threat to someone, so it needs to be fixed, a little split up. And that's always been their goal, and it always will continue to be their goal. The idea was always hatched, and plans were always hatched. Hopes were made that one way or another they would be able to do it. And he talks about this being a perennial objective now of the Western powers, going back decades, even centuries. And then he talks about how the Russians previously have followed a completely different approach. We always wanted to be part of this so-called civilized world. He means the West. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which we allowed with our own hands, for some reason it seemed to us that from day to day we would become part of this so-called civilized world. And as it turned out, we were not expected there, despite all our efforts and attempts. I say this referring to my work. I also made those attempts. Our attempts to get closer, to become part of the West, it ended in nothing. And note that he essentially admits his own mistake, that he tried to work with the West, tried to find accommodations with the West for too long, but he's now come to the realization that it is attitudes towards Russia, the West is implacable. And then he brings up the topic of the war in the Caucasus in the 1990s and 2000s. And he says that, on the contrary, the West took other actions, including the use of international terrorists in the Caucasus in order to finish off Russia and tear apart the newly created Russian Federation. Many of those present in this hall do not need to have this proved to them. You already know what happened in the mid-1990s, early 2000s. And they seemed to anathemize all kinds of Islamist terrorists. He actually refers to the well-known terrorist organization and other criminals, but their use on territory on the territory of Russia was considered acceptable. They were given all kinds of support, material, informational, political, whatever, including military, if only they fought against Russia. Thanks to the peoples of the Caucasus, thanks to the Chechen people, thanks to the heroism of our servicemen, we have passed this difficult period of our history. We have gone through these trials strengthened. And then he then goes on to talk about Ukraine. Our geopolitical rivals have begun to use everything. I don't want to offend anyone, but nevertheless I will say what lies badly for their own purposes. They have begun to engage in brainwashing in the countries of the post-Soviet space and above all in Ukraine. Moreover, they did it quite successfully and were well prepared for this, since even in Soviet times, entire institutions worked in this direction. And by that he means academic institutions across the Soviet Union. He is talking about a fact much discussed now in the Russian media and information space about how Russian Soviet academic institutions and even some governmental institutions became infiltrated, as they would say, or by liberal thinking, by pro-Western thinking, and that this has led to this crisis because it's turned large areas of the population against Russia. And he now suggests that this is all going to change. And then he talks about what he calls the coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014. And he talks about how Russia, for decades after the end of the Soviet Union, tried to forge good relations with Ukraine. We gave them loans and supplied almost free energy resources for years. Nothing worked, nothing. Let me remind you that during the period of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, when it left the Union in its declaration of independence, wrote that Ukraine is a neutral state. Therefore, in general, understand the then leadership, and in the conditions of that time, they probably did not see any threats. A neutral state, fraternal people, a single culture, common spiritual and moral values, a common history. We didn't see any threats. But no, the enemy, the West, in other words, he now calls it the enemy, worked very stubbornly, and we must pay tribute to them effectively. None of our actions to build these relationships, which we probably hoped for, were effective, and none achieved the desired goal. I want to emphasize this. There is nothing to reproach us for. I say this with complete responsibility. And then he talks about his own feelings to the Ukrainian people, which are well known, about how he still considers them, in spite of everything, to be a fraternal people, and how he sees what has happened in Ukraine as a tragedy. And then he talks with particular bitterness about the 21st February 2014 agreement, which has entered between the then president of Ukraine, President Yanukovych, and his opponents in the Maidan movement, which immediately preceded Yanukovych's overthrow. And he says the following, and again, his bitterness, his anger is very clear. So after the 2014 coup, I will not talk about the reasons for that coup now. I will only say it is unacceptable. Let me remind you that in February 2014, 3 foreign ministers of European countries, Poland, France and Germany, arrived in Kiev and signed as guarantors an agreement between the opposition and the Yanukovych government. A few days later, a coup d'etat took place. Everyone forgot about those guarantees as if they never existed. What should they have done? Simply say, dear friends, we are the guarantors, we are the largest European countries, we ask you to return to the negotiating table, go to the polls and resolve the issue of power with the help of political procedures. Yes, and everyone perfectly understood what was good or bad, that the Yanukovych government would certainly have lost an election, especially since the then president agreed to almost all the demands of the opposition, including early elections. And when I asked our so-called colleagues, well, why did you bring the matter to a coup d'etat? There is no answer. They just shrug their hands. Well, it happened. It just happened. That is, we were given to understand that no pro-Russian forces, any politicians, journalists, public figures who at least somehow raised their voice in favor of developing Russia, they were simply killed on the streets. No one investigated anything. It became clear that we would not be given any chance, no chance to restore relations with this part of our former common country. It is impossible, in fact. And then he talks about brainwashing of the people of Ukraine. He talks about the spread of the ideology of the 1930s, which I don't want to name, in Ukraine. He talks about all of that in great detail. And then he says that it was obvious that a clash with these forces in the light of all of this was inevitable. And he then says we will not repeat the mistakes of the past when, in the interests of increasing our defense capability, where necessary or where it was not really necessary, we destroyed our economy. So Russia will not go down the route of the Soviet Union. It will not overcommit to Ukraine. We will not engage in the militarization of our country and the militarization of the economy, primarily because the level of development achieved today, the structure of the economy do not require this. We simply do not need it. And then he goes on to say that nonetheless, we will improve the armed forces and the entire military component of the state. We will do it calmly, rhythmically, without fuss, and consistently. So the Russians, according to Putin, have basically had enough. They've tried very hard to build up a relationship with the West. It all failed. They were, in Russian eyes, double-crossed at every turn. If the West wants an arms race with Russia, it's now got it. If it wants a conflict with Ukraine in Russia, it's now got it as well. And Russia today, its economy has been reorganized to the point where it can sustain such an arms race, and the United States and its allies now face a build-up in Europe, even as they face a confrontation with China in the Far East at the same time. And in the meantime, just to highlight this, we now have the meeting between Xi Jinping and Medvedev in China. Now, it's been suggested that the reason it was a one-to-one meeting was because this was a meeting between the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, who is Xi Jinping, and the chairman of Russia's United Russia Party, who is Medvedev, and that this somehow means that on that basis, on a protocol basis, Xi Jinping is able to meet with Medvedev, and that there aren't any real protocol issues, and that this explains entirely why there is a one-to-one meeting. Well, if you think that, if that's what you think, that's fine, but I have a bridge to sell you, because Xi Jinping does not just meet leaders of political parties. He met Medvedev not just because Medvedev is the leader or nominal leader of the United Russia Party in Russia, even though that is the official explanation for the fact that there was a one-to-one meeting. He met Medvedev because he's a very senior Russian official, and he is the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council. And to make it absolutely clear that this was a meeting between high state officials, the highest state official on the Chinese side and a very high official on the Russian side, well, we have Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, attending the meeting alongside Xi Jinping. So clearly there was a meeting of importance. Now, the Chinese readout has been fairly thin, But we do read that Xi Jinping said the following. Xi noted that over the past decade, China-Russia relations have withstood the test of international changes and maintained sound, steady and high-level development. He said that developing a China-Russia comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination for a new era is a long-term strategic choice that the two sides have made based on their respective national conditions. China is ready to work with Russia to push forward China-Russia relations in the new era and make global governance more just and equitable. So who is not making it just and equitable? Well, of course, the hegemon, as the Chinese would say, of the United States and its friends. And then we see that on the Ukraine crisis, Xi said China decides its position and policy based on the merits of the matter concerned, upholds objectivity and fairness, and actively promotes peace talks. In other words, the Chinese are not going to be swayed by Western attempts to get them to put pressure on the Russians. And he did go on to say, hopefully relevant parties will remain rational and exercise restraint, carry out comprehensive dialogue and address joint security concerns through political means. Now note this, because it's an actually important phrase. Now some Westerners will interpret this as a criticism of Russia, but it is actually a criticism of the West, because both the Chinese and the Russians have repeatedly said that it is the failure of the Western powers to address Russian security concerns that has been the root cause of the problem. And when Xi talks about the relevant parties, he doesn't just mean Russia and Ukraine. He clearly refers to the West as well. He says that they must remain rational and exercise restraint, which of course that they are not doing. And when he talks about a comprehensive dialogue, he makes it clear that that means also addressing security concerns, including Russia's security concerns, which up to this point the Western powers have not been willing to do. These are very carefully chosen words, because the Chinese do not want to be seen as allying themselves straightforwardly with Russia in this conflict for the many reasons that I've discussed in previous videos. But when interpreted against the overall context of what the Chinese have been saying for many months now, it's quite clear which side essentially China rather, is quietly on. And to make that all entirely clear, we have in Global Times Wang Yiwei, director of the Institute of International Affairs at the Rearmament University of China, telling Global Times on Wednesday, the meeting has once again stressed the China-Russia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership of Coordination for a New Era, which clarifies the misunderstandings of some in the West who suspected an alliance between the two sides and have in turn used such rhetoric to create confrontation. And the meeting against such a backdrop could promote more profound and actual progress of peace talks amongst the parties concerned, as Russia itself has also in recent days repeatedly shown to willingness to engage in such dialogue. And then we have a quote from another Chinese expert, Cui Hunqian, director of the Department of European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. At least China can share its true feelings and thoughts on this issue with China. Interesting point. The Xi-Medvedev meeting will see if Russia and Ukraine's willingness to talk things through can lead to actual progress. So, there we go. We'll see where this goes, but clearly the Chinese and the Russians are on the same page where the Ukraine conflict is concerned, and both of them see the problem originating not with any aggressiveness on the part of Russia, but on the part of the policies of the United States. Anyway, this has been a very long video, an hour and a quarter. I think it's time I stopped. Important series of meetings. I hope you've gained some understanding, and at least of my opinions or assessment of what has happened. We see clearly how Russia and the West are now moving, it seems to me, into clear confrontation. When Olaf Scholz talks about avoiding a Cold War, the reality is he's got one, whether he likes to accept that fact or not. And I don't think there's anybody of importance in Moscow who disagrees with Putin's perspective on this. And we also see that Zelensky's visit to Washington has changed nothing of substance and has not made any real change to the direction of the conflict, whilst Medvedev and Xi's meetings highlight the fact that the Chinese-Russian relationship remains solid, with the United States now facing a challenge in two parts of the world. In Europe, where a huge Russian build-up is now going to happen, and in the Pacific, where we learn from Jack Watlin of the Royal United Services Institute, the United States is going to struggle to keep up its defense posture against China because it's having to send more and more weapons to Ukraine, even as relations between China and the United States get worse. Now, I'm going to end this program with one very last point, and that is that there's been a very interesting article in Axios which talks about the fact that Joe Biden apparently admitted on the 4th of November that the JCPOA, the nuclear deal between the United States and Iran, is dead. Now, if that's really the truth, then all I will say is that it's proof yet again of Joe Biden's propensity to say one thing and do something completely diametrically opposite. Apparently, he actually admitted that even as the United States has decided that the JCPOA is dead, it's going to pretend otherwise. We've seen where that has ended. Collapse of relations with Russia, deteriorating relations with China, possible confrontation with Iran as trust evaporates. A commitments crisis made even worse. The great achievement of this administration. I will stop now. More from me soon. Remember, you can find us on our other platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. Go to our shop, buy the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and all those things. Remember, if you've liked this video, very long as it is, to press the like button and check your subscription to this channel. And thank you again, if you've held out to this point, for seeing this thing through. And I look forward to you joining me again soon. And if you've liked this video, remember to press the like button, check your subscription to this channel, and of course, more from me soon.